In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, participants and attendees and followers on social media. Assalamu alaikum. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. On behalf of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, I would like to welcome you all to this 9th annual Gulf Studies Forum. It was launched by the Arab Center in December 2014 in order for this platform to be an academic space studying the affairs of the Arab Gulf and the different issues. And it also builds upon the knowledge of a network of researchers who focus on the Arab Gulf and the relations between the Gulf, the region, and the world. Since 2014, the forum held 8 successive meetings to include internal, regional, and international affairs, to include the economic reforms of the GCC, education, economic diversification in GCC countries, the Qatar blockade crisis, the social transformations and the problematic issue of identity in the GCC, the GCC-US relations, public policy in GCC countries, Iran, and Gulf sovereign funds. This year, we are going to study the current situation of the Gulf, tackling the most important crisis, which is the Ukraine crisis, the regional and international competition, and the future energy and security in the Gulf. Because although the Gulf is geographically away from the conflict, but it found itself at the heart of this conflict. With the disruption in the energy market, the United States and Europe actually look towards the 30% of oil reserves of the world in the Gulf, and the Gulf supplies 20% of the global needs in terms of gas in order to fill in the gaps resulted from the oil cuts from Russia, in addition to reducing inflation threatening the global economy. In addition to that, the crisis revealed some tensions in the traditional relations of the alliance linking between GCC countries and Western countries, especially the United States of America, as many Gulf countries try to adopt a neutral position in terms of the crisis between Russia and the Western countries, whereas the US and the EU were waiting for a more straightforward position condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The crisis had important repercussions on the food security of the GCC, with the increasing prices of food commodities because of the increasing prices of agriculture products. These topics and other topics are going to be discussed today and tomorrow with the participation of 22 researchers in 7 sessions and a general lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, followers through Zoom and social media platform, throughout the previous years, the 9 years, this forum has been considered a forum for excellence in terms of researchers, and researchers are keen to participate in this forum, and we are witnessing an annual increase in the participants, and we have an increasing number of applications through email. So we're talking about approximately 300 researchers from more than 35 countries from all over the world who presented research papers and policy issues, economy, society, economic diversification, media, Gulf identity, sovereign funds, public policy, investment policies, and the Ukraine crisis that we are going to discuss today. As a result of this increasing importance of the studies in the Gulf and the key role played by this region diplomatically and politically, economically, and in terms of energy, media, and sports, the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies decided to dedicate a special unit in the studies of Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula in order to fill the gaps when it comes to the studies in this region and present an overview about this region. There will be an annual uh, forum, and of course, researchers and studies are going to tackle the issues of the region in addition to having several workshops and seminars. I would like to seize this opportunity to invite everyone to cooperate with this emerging units in terms of achieving its objectives for which it was created. To conclude, on behalf of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, I would like to thank you all. Assalamu alaikum. Ladies and gentlemen, we will start directly with the first session. It will be with the participation of Dr. Abdullah al-Shaiji, Dr. Giorgio Cafiero, and the chair is Dr. Rashid Hamad Al-Nuaimi. Please join us here. Dr. Majid al-Turki, who was supposed to be one of the panelists, however, his flight was delayed, so his intervention is going to be presented tomorrow. Thank you. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, may the peace and blessings of God be upon our Prophet and upon you all. I would like to thank my colleagues at the level of the Arab Center for the invitation to tackle the impact of the Ukraine crisis and the regional and international competition and the future of energy and security in the Gulf. We are talking about an expanding conflict. We have also the energy crisis in Europe and its repercussions on Europe and the people of Europe. And there's also disagreement between the US and the allies regarding the oil production. This war added insult to injury when it comes to the international economy after the COVID pandemic, especially the European economy that is witnessing an unprecedented crisis. This is an unprecedented shock when it comes to energy supplies. The European dependence on Russian supplies resulted in very difficult confrontation with the people as a result of confronting Russia and the lack of alternatives and correct policies in terms of the diversification of the energy. And the energy deterrence and energy diplomacy was used by Russia more successfully or with more success. The future of energy security, in addition to the pressing crises, will result in decisions, political decisions, and this puts the Gulf and the leaderships of the Gulf in a very difficult confrontation with great powers and European allies, and maybe the repercussions might be dire and long term. Energy has become a priority for all. The energy crisis could be transformed into an important tool for Gulf countries and Middle Eastern countries in order to be used as part of a diplomatic energy approach in order to benefit at the level of the region. There are opportunities that are born during international crises. This is the energy diplomacy that surfaced today as an important tool to affect and to influence the international dynamics. The first speaker is Professor Abdullah Al-Shaiji. Professor Abdullah is a professor of international relations at Kuwait University, where he previously chaired the political science department. He published several books and research papers in referred Arabic journals. His most recent book is Gulf Cooperation Council Crisis. And he will be talking today about the topic entitled, How Does Russia's War on Ukraine Affect U.S. Gulf Relations? The floor is yours, sir. Thank you, Your Excellency, General Rashid. And it is a great pleasure for me to be here with you today. I would like to thank the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies and also Dr. Marwan. And it is my great pleasure to participate for the eighth time in this event. And I would like to thank the Arab Center for giving particular attention on these issues, especially the issues of the Arab Gulf, the internal dynamics, the security challenges, particularly given the fact that although the United States reduced the importance of the Gulf region since President Obama in 2011 2012 announced the pivot towards Asia, and the US centers are publishing annual studies. And last week there was a study about the national security strategy. In this study, it is very clear that the US no longer gives particular attention to the Gulf region, and as US studies and intelligence studies focus increasingly on containing China and focusing on Russia. So, unfortunately, there was a downgrading of the importance of the Gulf region, and as I discuss in this paper, and despite the neutrality that we adopted at the level of the GCC since the beginning of the war, the illegal and unjustified war declared by President Putin against Ukraine. It reminds us in Kuwait of the blatant invasion of Saddam Hussein and occupation of Kuwait, and this theatrical approach, a republic for one day and then annexed the 19th provinces of Iraq. At least Putin is a bit more or smarter. At least he did this fake referendum for these annexed territories. For the first time, actually, a president invades a country, of course, after 2014, what happened in Crimea and Georgia as well before that. So he invades a country, occupies parts of the country, and annexes these parts of the Ukrainian territories, and they hold a fake referendum, but it is a referendum. I think this leads to limited alliances in the world. The GCC, since the very beginning, was adopting positive neutrality, but the behavior recently, and even at the beginning of the war, the behavior was not 100% neutral. And I will be detailing this point. The most important thing is that the Ukraine war proved the mistake at the level of the US strategy and Europe's strategy to a certain extent when it comes to downgrading the importance of Gulf or GCC in terms of energy security. Because the United States is almost self sufficient when it comes to the oil and shale, actually, shale gas and shale oil that is produced by Texas, Alaska, and other states. So the United States is actually now exporter of refined oil, and the French president actually complained that it is being sold 4 times higher than the levels in the United States. So the importance of the Gulf was re-established. In my opinion, it resurfaced, and we saw a number of European officials, German officials visited Qatar, visited a number of Gulf countries in order to get Qatari gas supplies and also supplies from different Gulf countries. That was a key point in restoring the importance of the GCC. But what happened recently and the previous 2 weeks, since the 5th or the 6th of October, with the decision of OPEC Plus, of course, it was established in 2016, 13 OPEC countries plus 10 non OPEC countries to coordinate, of course, led by the OPEC countries are led by Saudi Arabia, the biggest oil and producer and actually exporter now because the US is the number one producer now, and Russia, which is the second um, biggest oil producer in the world. So there is an alliance, or it is an alliance that was described as being at the service of Russia in terms of reducing the OPEC plus production with a rate of 2 million barrels a day. Although this does not represent more than 2% of the international oil production, however, it resulted in a big repercussion in the United States because the timing was lethal when it comes to the Biden administration, and it was also lethal when it comes to the Democrats and his own chances of being re-elected in 2024. So all politics is local. And domestic audience comes first. This is what is usually said in the United States. Everything that we are seeing, confrontations and the criticism addressed to Saudi Arabia, so is the result of the politics, and even Biden actually attacked Saudi Arabia. Since the very beginning, it was actually a problematic relation with Saudi Arabia since the killing of Khashoggi, and he said that Saudi Arabia is going to become a pariah state, and then he took steps back, and then he visited Saudi Arabia. His visit on the 15th of July was a victory for Saudi Arabia and a defeat to Biden. And although he said that his visit to Saudi Arabia was not linked with the increasing oil production, but the result was the fact that Saudi Arabia increased by 100,000 barrels the next month, and that was it. So it is a tense relation. This is the way I can describe it between the two countries, and the main reason behind the criticism and the anger the US anger against OPEC Plus and Saudi Arabia is twofold. It helps Russia because Russia, when they sell the barrel at 90, is different than 60 and 70. Of course, there is an exaggeration when it comes to the US anger by saying that this serves the war in Ukraine, and the Americans and the Europeans are working through the sanctions in order to undermine Putin's capability of spending on this a military operation that is facing obstacles in Ukraine. I was in the United States for 2 months during the summer, and every day Biden used to tweet the gasoline prices are lower here. 30 states are witnessing lower prices because he used the strategic reserves that was founded by President Nixon after 73, 74, after the embargo or the blockade, or the boycott actually in this case. So they have the reserves in Texas and Louisiana, and is actually under the control of the US government. Biden 2 days ago talked about 15 million additional barrels pumped into the markets in order to reduce the gasoline prices because Americans vote with their pocket votes, with their wallets, not with OPEC, not with Iran, Gulf. They do not really care about it. The Americans When it comes to foreign policy, they say we do not know and we do not care what happens in the world. The upset attitude of the United States, and I will be talking about the relation between the Gulf and the United States. So, this storm, the anger storm launched by President Biden himself, the Secretary of State, the Security Council advisor, leaders at the level of the Congress, all of this might lead, or it is because the Democrats might lose the small minority that they have at the level of the House. We have 8 uh, MPs getting the majority for the Democrats, and they have a very difficult situation because of the increasing gasoline prices and also inflation. So this is intertwined. The inflation is at the highest, 8.5 percent. So it's the highest since 40 years, and it is resulting in the increasing of the prices. So the timing of the production cut resulted in a quick reaction in the United States. The gasoline prices increased to approximately $4 because of the OPEC Plus decision led by Saudi Arabia and Russia, and the timing on the 1st of November to reduce the production of OPEC Plus to 2 barrels a day. And it was perceived as an intervention in the US affairs, favoring the Republicans, and the Americans asked Saudi Arabia at least to postpone it until after the midterms and then study the market and then make a decision as to whether to reduce oil production or not. But Saudi Arabia insisted, and even the United States said that they were not convinced by the arguments of Saudi Arabia. But this is part of the US's perception towards the allies. The US does not perceive the junior partners outside of the United States as deserving of being listened to or heard, and this is part of this arrogant behavior by the United States. Even before the waging of the war by Russia against Ukraine in February, and we're talking about almost 8 months of difficult war, we were witnessing a decreasing presence of the United States in the Middle East. If we go back to what Trump said, he said, we actually have war fatigue in the United States. The people are suffering from war fatigue. Endless wars were quoted. And this should come to an end because we have bigger concerns and interests in or abroad. And as I have said when I first started talking, all security and intelligence US studies, MSS, NDS, and NIC, we're talking about military intelligence here. The NIC is the National Intelligence Council. We're talking about 17 agencies under one umbrella. So they all say that the United States has to change its strategy in the region and give more attention to the Gulf, or actually less from the Gulf and Middle East towards Asia, and China. And we're talking about the two sides of the Pacific today. So the official U.S. studies focus on the Indo-Pacific region. This is the top priority for the US strategy and the future. This is why we have seen many evidence that resulted in destabilizing the trust and the US ally. I have actually highlighted this in a study. The first transformation is the Biden decision and the nuclear deal. So they adopted the FYI approach with the Gulf countries. Obama in 2015, before signing the nuclear deal with Iran, had invited for a summit. He was commended for that. He is the first U.S. president since the establishment of the GCC in 1981 to hold a U.S. Gulf summit in Camp David. So we're talking about casual. So it's like a chalet place. It's not like an official uh, conference. So it was for him to get the approval or to convince the GCC to approve officially the nuclear deal that was signed 2 months later. The US Gulf relations were institutionalized. The second one was held in Riyadh in 2016. It was the last summit for President Obama. The third one was held in Riyadh, an Arab Islamic uh, Gulf summit attended by President Trump, and it was the first foreign visit. So instead of being to Canada, Britain, or Japan, he went to Saudi Arabia, and the Americans were actually surprised to see that the first foreign visit of Mr. Trump was to an Arab and Muslim country, Saudi Arabia. So since then, there was no summons because of the blockade of Qatar and Gulf crisis and the repercussions until today. Although there was a reconciliation in Al-Ula summit between the Gulf parties, so in January 2021, I have said in my intervention last year, actually here, the center through Zoom actually, that the reconciliation is not complete as long as we do not have a Qatari ambassador in Abu Dhabi and an Emirati ambassador in Doha, and the same applies to Bahrain and Qatar. So the reconciliation is not complete yet. The other evidence when it comes to the declining relations between the US and the Gulf was when President Trump did not respond when Iran used drones to bomb the Aramco industrial complex in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. Trump said that this accident happened on Saudi territories and not U.S. territories. This is why doubt and skepticism increased when it comes to the US and Gulf relations. Also, the third point was the assassination of Qasem Soleimani that could have resulted in a war between Iran and the Gulf because Iran could have chosen a base in the Gulf, but they decided to use ballistic missiles in Iraq. And of course, 100 US soldiers were actually seeking a shelter in Ain al-Assad base, and they had concussions. And this is actually the first retaliation. The third evidence is the retreating of the Patriot batteries in April of last year from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Jordan, and also the THAAD systems from these countries. In addition to the US position vis-a-vis putting pressure on Gulf countries to no longer adopt a neutral position vis-a-vis Putin's war and Russia by contributing in the sanctions and putting pressure on Russia. All of these things, in addition to what we have talked about regarding the decision of OPEC, and actually Biden administration insinuated there is a project that is being discussed at the level of the U.S. Congress, the level of the Judiciary Committee, which is the No OPEC, NOOPEC Act, and it actually it gives total U.S. Power to actually take OPEC countries to trial for increasing or reducing oil production and manipulating prices. This is a very dangerous act. It was passed on the 5th of the last month at the level of the Judiciary Committee, and now it is going to be debated at the level of the Senate. If it's adopted, it goes to the House. If it's adopted, it goes to President Biden's desk. If it's signed, it becomes law. So the United States will have the right to sue OPEC countries like Saudi, Russia and Kuwait, not Qatar. Qatar withdrew its membership in 2018. So they can sue them for manipulating prices and the increase and decrease of production. The national oil companies as well. This is extremely dangerous because it goes against international law and the sovereign immunity given to countries. Because a country cannot sue another country for what the other country is doing in this regard, because this would result in trials against the United States, and this would cause chaos at the level of the international relations. So, if the no OPEC law is going to be adopted, I do not think it will, because the oil lobby is against the law. But this is actually an attempt to threaten OPEC countries and Saudi Arabia, saying we have leverage that we can use against these countries. The important point when it comes to the relation with the United States was the confused withdrawal from Afghanistan. That actually troubled the trust in the US ally after 20 years of war against Afghanistan in October 2001, 1 month after the September 11 attacks, the illegal invasion of Afghanistan and occupation by the US of Afghanistan. So we witnessed a very confused and we can say actually humiliating withdrawal in August 2021 without achieving any of its objectives. 2,400 soldiers lost, 20,000 injured, $2 trillion. They did not achieve anything. Taliban returned stronger than before. This reverberated, this had several repercussions when it comes to all allies, particularly the allies at the level of the GCC. Had it not been for the support of the Gulf countries by this air corridor, especially the Qatari leadership and Qatar Airways, to evacuate 100,000 persons after the withdrawal of the United States. Even Biden was criticized for committing a lethal strategic mistake. How can you withdraw your forces from Afghanistan without securing the US citizens, the green card holders, the people who were cooperating with the United States? They were left to their own fate with the Taliban who took control of Kabul. This led to a recalculation. Saudi Arabia signed a military economic agreement with Russia, and we saw Prince Khalid bin Salman signing this deal, and Iran actually had a huge a strategic deal, $400 million with China. So there is a rapprochement in the region with Russia and with China, with a declining presence and pledges by or commitment by the United States. If we also take into account Biden's strategy for national security that was announced last week, I wrote an article to be published on Monday in Al-Quds Al-Arabi. The national security strategy of the United States announced in 48 pages. He focuses on the great power rivalry. So this is the great power rivalry. The Gulf and Middle East is not mentioned. 3 minutes, okay. So the national strategy of the United States does not solve the crises in the Middle East, and it is void of clear details and even initiatives in order to deal with the Gulf and Middle East crisis, which reinforces the fact that the US presidents, starting Obama and then Trump and then Biden, after all this chaos caused by George W. Bush and his wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Uh, so this results in reducing the importance of the Middle East in terms of the US strategy and the successive administrations. This is an ongoing trend. This is a message to us at the level of the GCC. Maybe we are a bit late, but we should start from now coordinating in a better way, especially if the Gulf reconciliation is complete. The strategy of the Biden administration provides an inefficient roadmap in the Middle East to include the protection, of course, the slogan protecting the allies from regional and international threats, so GCC and Israel, and supporting the human rights issues without involving the United States with military presence. Robert Ford, in a study in the Atlantic 3 days ago, he is the last U.S. ambassador in Syria. He says that there is quite a lot of similarities between the Trump and the Biden strategies for national security. Trump's strategy focused on Iran threat. The strategy of Biden focuses on the destabilizing activities by Iran and the Gulf and the Middle East, and the United States is to retaliate by protecting its interests. The two strategies actually pledge to support the regional partners. This is the dangerous bit when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. So they're talking about the threats of Iran. Since the Trump days, they were talking about security, military, and economic cooperation and achieving regional security, the Abraham Accord. Also, now we're seeing the demarcation of the borders between Israel and Lebanon days ago. So the Americans actually are pushing also towards missile defense system and maritime defense system. This will be delayed if the continued storm does not stop. Even until yesterday, from the White House, there were statements that the OPEC Plus decision was short-sighted and it was not in favor of the strategic alliance, and it would have repercussions. And the Trump and the Biden administration is going to re-evaluate the relationship with Saudi Arabia in coordination with the Congress after his return. And the Congress is actually, even the Mr. Bob Menendez, the head of the Foreign Relations Committee, actually asked to freeze the military cooperation with Saudi Arabia until they change the position. Ghana as well asked to sanction Saudi Arabia for this provocative act. This is the first time I hear these statements publicly delivered from the two parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. They rarely agree on anything, especially after Trump's chaos from within. So they agree with this literature against an important strategic partner like Saudi Arabia. What about the smaller allies? So this is a threatening statement that intoxicates the relation and increases the trust deficit with the United States. And to conclude, unfortunately, as Gulf countries, we do not have options. Our capabilities do not deter Iran, do not deter other powers. We do not have a unified position at the level of the Gulf, and we do not have other practical solutions. Russia is not going to be here, not also China. They do not have the intention or the capability, and the US knows that the only kid in town is the United States. Take it or leave it. This is the US approach when it comes to dealing with these smaller allies. To conclude, Doctor, Your Excellency, I would like to say that we are no longer neutral in this war launched by Russia against Ukraine. We are no longer neutral from a US perspective. The Emirates shocked the US and the West when they abstained from voting on the Security Council on the 25th of February, one day after the Russian invasion. The UAE abstained from voting at the level of the Security Council, and it was heavily criticized. At the level of the General Assembly, they voted to condemn Russia, and we all voted to condemn Russia. 141 countries, the isolation of Russia. Who are the allies of Russia? Belarus, Syria, even Iran abstained, actually. North Korea. They have 4 or 5 countries as allies. So, actually, failed states. Failed states. So, yeah, failed states. That's not derogatory. It's actually fragile or failed state. So 141 countries voted against Russia. 143 voted against the annexation of the 4 regions in Ukraine. And we are perceived by the Americans because of our position as being biased after the decision to reduce the production. All Gulf countries voted in favor. The Americans said some countries called us and then said we did not want to, but it was a unanimous position or consensual position. But the U.S. actually wanted to create a divide. So I would like to conclude by saying we have large interests with the United States. The U.S. is not going to leave the region. The U.S. Considers the energy security as important, and we are facing a recession in the coming months, and this means that the United States also should uh, re-evaluate the decision to reduce the importance of the Gulf uh, region, and this Ukraine war actually highlighted the importance of the Gulf region.
Thank you, Dr. Abdullah al-Shaiji. Thank you, Dr. Abdullah al-Shaiji, for his paper. Before we move to the second paper, we will open the floor for Q's and A's at the end of this. With us now, Dr. Giorgio Cafiero, he founder and CEO of the Gulf State Analytics in Washington, D.C. He has an MA from San Diego University. His his research concerns are focused on the Arabian Peninsula and the broader Middle East. He will be speaking on the implications of the Ukrainian crisis for the relations between Arab Gulf states and Russia. شكرا
First of all,
جزيلا
thank
لكم.
everyone for coming
أود
today, and I
قبل
want to
كل
thank the
شيء
organizers of this event for making it possible. It's always good to be here in Doha, and it's wonderful to see so many colleagues and friends. To state the obvious up front, the overt Russian invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February was nothing short of a geopolitical tsunami that completely changed the world. Not only did it completely change the geopolitical order and the security landscape in Europe, but the reverberations and the shocks have been felt all over the Middle East and many other regions as well. In general, I think it's safe to say that the US and its allies in Western Europe have looked at this conflict very differently from how the member states of the GCC have looked at the conflict. In Washington, as well as other Western capitals, this is seen as a very black and white conflict. Russia, the aggressor is seen very much as the guilty party, the devil, and Ukraine is seen as the innocent, pristine actor. And the view in Washington is that countries should not be neutral in this conflict. Again, it's seen in very simplistic, very black and white terms. In the Gulf region, it is not seen in such a simplistic manner. This is not to say that any GCC country has supported Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That is certainly not the case, but the view is that this is very much a European conflict, and GCC states do not welcome pressure that Western governments have been trying to put on actors in the Arab region to firmly align with Western powers against Russia. In what's obvious when we talk about GCC-Russia relations is that we're talking about 6 unique bilateral relationships. The GCC as a whole does not have exactly one single relationship with Russia. Again, it varies from one member state to another. But what we do see across the board in the GCC is a belief that even if the Russian invasion of Ukraine was in flagrant violation of international law, if it was criminal conduct, this is still not reason to completely burn bridges with Russia. GCC states over the years have developed cooperative relations with Russia to varying degrees. I would probably say that the UAE and Saudi Arabia are the GCC states that have cooperated most deeply with Moscow, but the other four GCC states also have important ties with Russia that have strengthened over the years, whether we're talking about energy, counterterrorism, investment, tourism, so on and so forth. There are cooperative ties between the GCC members in Russia, and the view in the Gulf is that the invasion of Ukraine is not a reason to completely abandon Russia. In a grander geopolitical context, when we look at GCC-Russia relations, it's important to see how Arab Gulf states view Washington and American leadership in the MENA region. I would say that really when you go back to the period immediately after the Cold War finished, going back to the 1990s, there was frustration with how the Clinton administration was handling the so-called peace process between the Israelis and Palestinians. Then the next administration with George W. Bush in the White House, there was the disastrous US and UK invasion of Iraq that fueled much instability. Then there was a lot of dissatisfaction on the part of GCC states with how the Obama administration handled the Arab Spring uprisings of 2011. And also some in the GCC were very disappointed with how the Obama administration negotiated the JCPOA with Iran. And then also with Trump, there was the lack of a response to the September 2019 Aramco attacks. And obviously with Biden in the White House, there has been a lot of dissatisfaction with many aspects of US foreign policy. All of this is to say, since the 1990s, the GCC states have been increasingly doubtful about the wisdom of depending on US leadership so much. View is that the US is unreliable and that it's important to not burn bridges with the US, but to at least diversify international partnerships and alliances. And there's no doubt that along with India and China, Russia has played an important role in terms of how GCC states have been looking eastward and preparing for a world that is more multipolar and much less Western-centric. So again, while the GCC states have had problems with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the fact that Russia is an important pole in a new emerging multipolar world, and the fact that GCC states are very interested in becoming much more autonomous from the US, this helps us understand why GCC states have chosen not to burn their bridges with Moscow just because of this conflict in Ukraine. A problem, however, has to do with the implications for GCC members' relations with Washington. As great power competition intensifies and the world's geopolitical order increasingly bifurcates between East and West, officials in Washington are not very tolerant of countries in this world which want to be neutral. This is a time when the Ukraine conflict is very central to the focus of US decision makers and also decision makers in Western Europe. This is a time when the message from Washington is very much you're either with us or against us. And what might be a neutral stance is not necessarily seen in Washington as a neutral stance. Now, it's very clear when you look at the UN General Assembly votes and even the most recent UN Security Council vote, the GCC states and basically every Arab state, with the exception of Syria, has come out against Russian invasion, occupation, and annexation of Ukrainian territory. But the issue, though, is that is pretty much all Arab states agree this should not result in support for Western sanctions against Russia. And the view is that Russia should not necessarily be singled out internationally because of the conflict in Ukraine. That, I think, is misunderstood in Washington, and also in light of the October 5 decision with OPEC Plus. I believe it's very true that Saudi Arabia was motivated by its own economic, financial, and commercial interests, and the decision to support that production cut made much financial sense. But again, the perception in Washington, though, is that this was about aligning geopolitically with Putin's government, even though, in my opinion, that represents a misunderstanding of where Saudi Arabia and other Gulf members of OPEC Plus stand. There is still a lot of room for that to create some major problems in the relationship with Washington moving forward. It's also important to point out that for GCC states such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, responding to the conflict in Ukraine the way that they have has been very important to their determination to send a message to Washington that they are independent countries and that they are pursuing foreign policy agendas geared toward advancing their national interests. And if those foreign policy agendas align with Washington's interests, that's great. But if they don't, then that's also not necessarily a problem. But there is so much dissatisfaction with U.S. foreign policy, a belief that Washington has not been a reliable partner or ally of GCC states. And I think there's this conflict in Ukraine has been an opportunity to demonstrate to Washington that there is some anger and growing distrust that has undermined these partnerships over the years. For example, after Joe Biden's visit to Jeddah in July, I forgot exactly how much time passed, but just a few days after Biden left the kingdom, there was a phone call between the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Vladimir Putin, in which they talked about the importance of the Saudi-Russian relationship and the need for Riyadh and Moscow to deepen bilateral cooperation. And that certainly sent a very strong message to the White House that while the GCC states were very pleased to see Biden come to the kingdom and to discuss Washington's interest in mending fences with some GCC countries, that was not going to result in Saudi Arabia making any changes to its relationship with Russia. And I would argue that since Biden's visit to the kingdom, there have been no signs of any desire on the part of Riyadh to make any fundamental changes to its relationship with Moscow. It goes without saying that Russia is very happy to try to take advantage of the tensions between Washington and GCC states. We saw what happened in 2015 when Russia intensified its direct military intervention in Syria. That sent out a very important message to not only countries in the GCC, but throughout the Arab world, that unlike the US, which was seen as not being a reliable ally or partner, that Russia was willing to fight very hard and to get involved in a civil war to stand up for an Arab state that was one of its allies. Even if most of the GCC states did not support Russia's intervention in Syria, there was an important point to take away about how Russia was committed to asserting itself in the Arab region as sort of a pillar of a new security landscape. And since 2015, Russia has worked hard to push that narrative in the Arab world. There's no doubt that on certain regional files, not only Syria, but also Libya, where some countries such as the UAE are not very comfortable with the US foreign policy positions. Russia has positioned itself in certain ways that has created some more alignment between Moscow and some members of the GCC, and that has also served to advance the Kremlin's agenda of taking advantage of some distrust and tension in US-GCC relations. Also, when Mohammed bin Salman came to Argentina in late 2018, shortly after the Khashoggi murder, many of the Western leaders were shunning the crown prince and isolating him, but Putin was very quick to embrace him. This has sent a message out that Russia is not interested in meddling in what it sees as internal affairs of Arab states. And that is also a dynamic that has been, I think from the Saudi government's perspective, it's something that makes Russia a partner that is appealing to work with. However, I want to stress, though, that there is a big difference between Russia exploiting tensions between the GCC countries and the US and Russia replacing the US as a security guarantor. Even prior to the Ukraine shock of February 24, I think there was absolutely no signs whatsoever that the Russians had the ability or the willingness to replace the US as a security guarantor for GCC states. I think here in the Gulf, government officials have seen the performance of the Russian military in Ukraine, and that only adds to the perception that Russia is in no position whatsoever to create some sort of a new geopolitical order or to replace the United States as a security guarantor. And I think it's very clear that the US is going to, for the foreseeable future, continue to be the security guarantor of the GCC states. What this probably means is that for Arab countries which are desiring more of a multipolar world, they will still see Russia as an important pole, an important pillar in this less Western-centric order, but probably there's going to be more importance placed on China at the expense of Russia moving forward. In many ways, this contributes to my view that Beijing has benefited in many ways from the damage to Russia's image and reputation internationally, including here in the Gulf region. I will just end with one final point about GCC efforts to help the parties wind down the conflict in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine. As mentioned, the GCC states have embraced a position of relative neutrality, and the Emiratis, Qataris, and Saudis have worked to take advantage of their positions as countries that have good relations with both Ukraine and its NATO backers on one side, as well as Russia on the other. We've seen on numerous occasions leaders of these three Gulf Arab countries communicating with the Russian leadership as well as the Ukrainian leadership, trying to take steps that can help facilitate some sort of a middle ground that could possibly move the conflict in a direction toward de-escalation. We saw last month, along with the Turks, the Saudis were able to broker an arrangement in which there were prisoner swaps. I think the GCC countries are in a position to continue doing things like this. I think that's very fortunate. But I do have to say, though, that for despite all the good intentions of the GCC countries to try to help move the conflict in the direction of de-escalation, there is a limit to what the GCC countries will be able to do on this front. And I say that because I'm not so sure that the two sides in the Russian-Ukrainian war really want to sit down, negotiate, and compromise. And until that changes, I think it might be a little difficult to imagine either Doha, Abu Dhabi, or Riyadh being able to help facilitate some kind of a breakthrough. This is what I'm saying right now in October 2022. It goes without saying that as time passes, the circumstances could change, and I would like to be optimistic that maybe further down the line, GCC states' mediation efforts could bear some fruit and contribute to some sort of a de-escalation, a resolution, or at least a freezing of the conflict. I think as this conflict is now almost 8 months old, we have seen the implications from the standpoint of food security crises to refugees, and the thoughts of this conflict continuing in the months and years ahead is absolutely terrifying. And I certainly hope that the neutral positions of GCC states will be able to help us and help the world move past this crisis, and hopefully at some point, maybe sooner than we expect, be able to consider the possibility of peace returning to Ukraine.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. George. Now we open the floor for your questions and answers. Please be brief, make your questions pointed, and state to whom you're posing the question. Thank you, Chair. First of all, I am from Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. I want to express my happiness and gratitude for being here. After that dreaded crisis, I pray to God that we will never go through it again. And today, when I said hello to some friends, I was almost tearful that we pray to God that we as Arabian Gulf countries remain as one family and the Arab world in general. Thank you, Dr. Abdullah al-Shaiji. My name is Dr. Zaid Al-Fadil from the Arab Center for Research. Dr. Abdullah al-Shaiji started with directing us that the similarity between the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the invasion of not Iraq but Saddam Hussein of Kuwait, although there is a difference because Russia thinks that or perceives a threat from NATO against it, whereas Kuwait never posed a threat to Iraq. Maybe also, and the same goes to the war in Yemen, as we fear there is a security threat coming from the Houthis and Iran in Yemen, and similarly to what the Russians are feeling vis-a-vis the Ukraine. Another point, our relations with the United States goes back a long way, and let's not forget America's stance in liberating Kuwait. We should not just cry over the past. Why is it, we have to ask ourselves this question, why is it that both Republicans and Democrats are revisiting their relations with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf? There must be a reason. Maybe the fault lies in us or them. We received Trump and gave him a huge service. We gave him so much money he was proud of. Yet there is this defect in the relations. And secondly, don't you see that if we edge closer to Russia, maybe this will improve our relations with Iran. Prince Mohammed bin Salman, when he received President Trump, said that we must resort to realistic solutions. I'm a historian. We are in the 21st century. We should not live the 21st century with ideas from the 20th century. Maybe this can open the. You, you asked about improving relations with Russia and the Gulf? Yes. Assalamu alaikum. A question to both panelists, and I hope to hear their response. I wonder if Trump was in power today in America, will the American position be the same vis-à-vis the Russian-Ukrainian war? And will the Saudi and the United Arab Emirates, who are being a little bit mischievous vis-à-vis Biden, will we see this impact the 2024 elections and the possible return of Trump to power? I start with Dr. Abdullah Shachi. Said maybe the war in the Ukraine can be a blessing in disguise. American bullying in the past towards the Arab positions and the Gulf positions, doesn't this lead to the Gulf countries rethinking their own differences and starting a new axis based on politics and economy? Dr. Giorgio Cafiero, how does the American administration look at this misunderstanding which is repeatedly occurring time and again towards the Gulf countries? I hope people in administration can listen to your presentation here and look at the relations with the Gulf countries as one based on cooperation and mutual respect. And also the rather pessimistic view of Gulf countries towards mending bridges between Russia and Ukraine. I beg to disagree with you. I think the Gulf countries can do something about the situation in the Ukraine to ease the tension. We take two questions and we start asking the panelists to respond. Assalamu alaikum. Can you introduce yourself? Ali Hassan from Algeria. We thank both panelists. My question is to Dr. Abdullah Shaiji. In your presentation, you said Russia's war on the Ukraine is unjustified. How do you explain that? We know that the Russian security doctrine is aimed at protecting its national security to the furthest point in their borders. And also, if the Ukraine joins NATO, that means that NATO missiles will be a minute or two away from Moscow. So therefore, this war then is justified, not unjustifiable. To what extent, how do you see the future? Is there any hope of Iran and the Gulf countries sorting out their problems? Shukran jazilan.
And I am so grateful to the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for having this fantastic event, academic event, where so much of proud brains and bright brains and minds meet each other in these walls. Thank you very much. This is really great advantage to be here. But just only I am not in agreement with the title, the Ukrainian crisis. Rather, this is the crisis of civilization caused by the Russian aggression against Ukraine. I have two small questions for both of the panelists, but let me in one word to respond to the previous question. Justified war? Does it mean that Russia has, following the same logic, to launch immediate war against Finland and Sweden upon their arrival, or actually even desire to join NATO? Does it mean that the missiles from the territory of Poland, let's say the possible missiles, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia or Latvia, does not hit Russia? Whether Ukraine have proclaimed its intention to fight with Russia before this aggression? Actually, we were, for 30 years more, were neutral. We have relinquished our third in power nuclear arsenal just with the intention to live in peace and security. And this means that the system of the international guarantees, check and balances does not work. That is why this is a crisis of the civilization. And right now, just let me ask the questions for two respectful panelists. It is proved by the military researchers that any military conflict in which Russia took part more than 8 months were the failure for Russia. It was analysis for 300 years. We are 2 days before breaking the 8 months period of this full-scale war. In fact, this war started in 2014, more than 3,150 days. Russia is losing, it is clear enough already. The civilization is united. Right now, the NATO is much more stronger and also united than it used to be before this aggression. The question is, we have heard fantastic and quite a detailed analysis of the current and past relations between the Gulf countries, and United States and Russia. What do you think will be the next steps and the immediate perspectives of the relations of GCC and United States and respectively Russia? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can you pass it around, please? Thank you.
شكرا سعادة الرئيس، شكرا للأخوة الزملاء. سؤالي حق الدكتور عبد الله.
al-Shaiji, maybe a technical question rather than a political one. The Ukrainian crisis is all about oil and gas, in the opinion of same. I think there is too much emphasis on the oil side and they ignoring the gas aspect. Maybe because the American companies sell the gas with 4 times the price in Europe, and compared to 2015, 2016, until now, the prices are under control so far as the oil is concerned. We see a lot of pressure on the OPEC because of the oil and not much pressure because of the gas, despite the gas now is the lifesaver so far as bills are concerned, electricity, heating, etc. But the emphasis on the oil. We'll take the first round of responses, and then if we have time, we go back again. Thank you for all your questions. It seems that most of the questions are directed to me personally. The question then, where does the fault lie? The fault lies in the fact that the American Gulf relations is not on a parity. There is a security dilemma. Glenn Snyder, one of the well-known theorists, speaks about the security dilemma for the junior weak partners and allies with the United States. They find themselves either captive to that or they're just subjugated. When America decided to assassinate Qasem Soleimani, they did not consult us. When America signed the nuclear deal with Iran, did not consult us. They did not even take into consideration our fears. For this reason, Iran took that in the days of Obama as a green light to impose its will and hegemony on 4 Arab capitals. They do not care for us. Obama went as far as calling us free riders. In his memoirs, the journals, I wrote a book about the American presidents from from George Washington to George Bush, and in the second volume I covered Clinton, Bush, and Obama. He said, let Saudi Arabia and Iran share influence over the Middle East. I think the fault lies in the fact that America no longer looks at us as an important source of energy, including oil. Our colleague said, why the emphasis on the gas and not oil? We all, by and large, oil countries, except Qatar has the second largest reserves in the world, and in the north field that Iran calls Pars is shared between Iran and Qatar. Qatar owns 2/3, Iran owns 1/3. And Europe needs gas. Germany got to the point of exporting 40% of its gas from Russia. Maybe for this reason, Germany was playing the role of the hawk in the dealings with Russia. And also what Dr. Mustafa Bazirgan said about my comment, a blessing in disguise. It's true, if the time hasn't come now for the GCC countries to give up this hesitancy and reliance on America and be prepared to see Russian and Chinese bases, although this is a bit far away, because nobody can take care of your own needs as you can. Of course, a joint missile defense shield, maritime and air, and and Israel, of course, was invited to be part of it. This is another problem because we have 2 countries who already normalized relations with Israel, and the others are doing it with a lighter touch, except for Kuwait, which is the only hawk in this. America has shrunk its interest in the Gulf, and from that day onwards, we should have started to rethink our position and what we can do to minimize our reliance on America, because America has downgraded its presence. And Richard Haas wrote an important book on how the American internal situation and this huge rift, which can lead to a civil war between the followers of Trump, now that he was summoned to a hearing of some sort, an investigation, and his followers do not seem to be care much about norms and laws. They stormed the Capitol and they said that the elections were rigged and fake, etc. And this is all happening in America, which has been teaching us democracy. I know America. I lived there. I taught there, but I think there, those who say "Make America Great Again," Republicans and others. If America is torn internally, this will impact its foreign policy. America now is looking inwards. America is not caring much about us, and we're completely lost. So the fault lies in both of us. When America, well, I'm not saying we should necessarily should replace America by Russia. All what Russia has is one sole aircraft carrier, and every time they fly airplanes, some of them fall into the sea. China is now attempting to have two, I think, instead of one. So therefore, I don't think there'll be a strategic reliance on Russia. Russia will not be a strategic ally, not even with Iran. It's true that we did not side with Russia nor America as GCC countries by and large, but also when we see Russia looking at Iran as a tactical partner, not a strategic partner, and Iran has provided Russia with drones, Shahid and others, and they're wreaking havoc in Kiev and other cities to the power supplies and infrastructure. Of course, we see another example of double standards. When everybody gave weapons to the Ukraine, nobody said anything. But when Iran gave Russia these drones, and they're just old versions of Chinese technology, everybody started. The same also happened with Turkey when they provided drones to Ukraine. As for Dr. Osama's question, it's an important question, but the Americans have a saying which can be applicable to the relations between Putin and Trump. You may have noticed, Dr. Osama, that Trump did not leave a leader in the world without saying some derogatory remarks or saying he's not a politician. He's a transactional president. He's a man who knows this and he deals at the level of the street. The Americans say the useful idiot. Trump was a useful idiot to Putin. If Trump was still in power, and some say Putin has secret recordings of Trump when he was in the Miss World Beauty galas, etc. I think Trump did not dare criticize Russia because of Crimea. Now he would not have criticized Putin, neither Putin nor Netanyahu for that matter. Trump wouldn't have dared to criticize him if he was in power. The war, where is our friend from Algeria? By international law, this is an illegal aggression. Even what Bush did in Afghanistan and Iraq were also illegal wars. Even when Kofi Annan was put in a tight corner 4 years later, the BBC correspondent asked him, "Is the Bush war of Afghanistan?" Kofi Annan said, "It's illegal." The liberation of Kuwait was a legal war because 12 resolutions under Chapter 7, and Saddam Hussein was given a deadline to withdraw, otherwise there'll be grave consequences. So everybody, if Saddam Hussein didn't withdraw by the 15th of January, the war was launched with the participation of 33 countries under the flag of the UN. Who was with Russia when they invaded Ukraine? Name one country. Belarus? Maybe? Belarus. Because it's a simple follower of Russia. Iran abstained. Even Algeria, your own country, abstained. They did not So the legal war is that war which is conducted legally under UN chapter according to Chapter 7. But just on the pretext of a preemptive war like what Bush did in Afghanistan is illegal. You said to me, give me justifications. This is as clear as daylight. I do not need to give you any justifications. The last question, I'm not sure I understood correctly. Will the relations between Russia and the Gulf impact هل تعني بسؤالك كيف أن دول مجلس التعاون والعلاقات بينه وبين روسيا ستؤثر علاقات دول الخليج مع
A bit different. What are the perspectives, immediate perspectives of relations between GCC and both United States and Russia? And if I have a microphone, for a second, one comment. I think that when United States and other allies supply Ukraine with weapons to defend itself, this is a great difference when Iran is supplying Russia without any pretext weapons to kill Ukrainians, to kill pregnant ladies, to make shelling attack. So this is not the prejudice to what one country.
From their perspective, they disagree with you. US, NATO countries are arming you, and Iran until now, today, they deny they're supplying the Russians with the drones. Officially, I'm saying. Now you have to prove that Iran is supplying drones, lethal drones, suicidal drones, with confirmed evidence that put Iran on the stage that Iran is lying. Iran is supplying the Russian army with drones, suicidal drones. Even the US Pentagon, United States Pentagon, stated that there are some revolutionary guard from Iran in the Crimea advising and helping the Russians to launch these suicidal drones. Now the ounce is on Ukraine and the West to prove Iran is lying.
We have material evidences.
Okay.
Ambassador, George, if you want to add something.
Sure. Well, thank you.
شكرا جزيلا لهذه الأسئلة الرائعة. كان إذا فهمت السؤال بشكل صحيح كيف أن إدارة بايدن تتطلع إلى علاقات واشنطن مع مجلس التعاون
I didn't make earlier in my first set of remarks. Obviously, right now, this is just a period of time leading up to an important midterm election in the United States. And I think as we're seeing sort of this shouting match between officials in Washington and Riyadh, it's important to keep in mind the timing of everything in U.S. domestic politics. Talking about this so-called NOPEC legislation, it sits well with many American voters, and bashing OPEC as a cartel is something that also sits well with American voters, American truck drivers who are worried about the price at the pump. But I do think that when this midterm election is over next month, we should expect to see some of the rhetoric cool down and to see a little bit more pragmatic moves on the part of the U.S. leadership. I certainly could be wrong. I don't know this for sure, but I have a feeling that the tensions between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia in relation to the situation in Ukraine, as well as the situation with OPEC, are not going to lead to any fundamental changes in the U.S. partnership with Saudi Arabia. There are many analysts and pundits who always talk about this so-called security for oil bargain. It's very reductionist. There's a lot more to this relationship than just oil. No matter what happens with OPEC Plus and with the conflict in Ukraine, the U.S. is going to see the Islamic Republic of Iran as a very toxic and predatory actor in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia has this view as well. So common cause when it comes to countering Iran will always keep the U.S. and Saudi Arabia aligned to some sense. There's also commercial investment and trade relations, which are very important. The U.S. also wants to see Israel further integrated into the wider Arab and Islamic world. Of course, Saudi Arabia is not part of the Abraham Accords, but Saudi Arabia has been moving towards some sort of a de facto normalization with Israel that is unofficial and tacit, but that's something that the Biden administration very much values about the U.S., about Saudi Arabia. At the end of the day, the Biden administration does believe that Saudi Arabia is an important partner of the United States, and I don't think the October 5 announcement from OPEC Plus is going to change that. To be clear, this is a partnership that has never been based on values, but it has been based on many shared interests. Yes, this partnership has been fraying. This partnership is strained in many ways. I don't think the problems are trivial, and I don't think the problems are going away. But at the end of the day, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have many common interests, and I think as long as these mutual interests continue to exist, the partnership is going to survive. We need to also see this in a historic context too, whether we're talking about the 1973 oil embargo, the fallout from the 9/11 attacks, the Iraq War, the JCPOA. There have been many episodes in the past that created some huge challenges for the U.S.-Saudi partnership, but it's been a partnership that's resilient. And if I had to bet money one way or the other, I think it's a partnership that is going to continue existing. It might become less friendly. I think with Biden in the White House, it's going to have some problems, and I'm not trying to be dismissive of the fact that these are serious problems, but for all this talk from heated politicians in Washington about ending the U.S. partnership with Saudi Arabia, my main point would be that it's important to see this within the context of an important midterm election coming up, and we'll move past November 8th, and I think there's going to be some calmer approaches toward this partnership. And this leads me also to the question about kind of the future of this triangular relationship between the U.S., the GCC countries, and Russia. There's no doubt that as the world is more multipolar and the U.S. doesn't have the strong hand of influence in the Middle East that it used to have, countries in the GCC are better positioned to leverage their relationships with Russia and China to try to maybe get a little more out of the partnerships that they have with Washington. I think moving forward, Saudi Arabia will be keen to continue close relations with the U.S., Russia, and China. When it comes to the U.S., this is most importantly pertaining to the defense and security domain. When it comes to Russia, this has a lot to do with energy, oil cooperation, and with China, this is largely about commercial investment and economic relations. I think Saudi Arabia, to its credit, has done an impressive job of balancing the kingdom's partnerships with all three of these global powers. I think it's going to probably continue striking this balance down the line. And as I said, as much as the U.S. is unsettled by Riyadh moving closer, and also other GCC capitals moving closer to China and Russia, I don't expect the fundamentals of the U.S. partnerships with Saudi Arabia and some of these other GCC countries to change. I think maybe there were a few more questions, but I'll.
Dr. Abdullah.
Dr. Abdullah, on social media, there were two questions addressed to you. So, building partnerships with China and Russia, does it not impose on the United States to re-establish partnerships with Gulf countries? So, okay, I got the question. Okay. Second question. Actually, it's the same question for you both. So, the United States, as I have said, reduced the importance of the Middle East. So, endless wars, no horizons. According to Brown Institute in the United States, we're talking about 7 trillion US dollars spent on Iraq, Afghanistan, and terrorism, and approximately 10,000 killed, 10,000 killed soldiers, and 10,000 killed contractors, and also a large percentage of US forces are ruined for life. They need medical treatment, assistance, be it physical or psychological. This is also included in the cost. Every day, between 10 to 15 soldiers who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan commit suicide in the United States. So the situation is dire when it comes to, because of actually Bush's wars that were continued by Obama and Trump to a certain extent, until Biden put an end to it and said, I will not be the fourth president to continue this war in Afghanistan. So yes, reconsidering, reevaluating. Yes, sometimes, and I agree with Dr. Bazargan, there are two things that we can talk about. We get our act together as GCC, and the GCC need to start thinking outside the traditional concept of relying and depending on the United States that is there and supporting. Just like my dear friend Giorgio said, the US is not a reliable partner as we are. So the presence of the United States in the Gulf does not cost the taxpayer in the US 1 cent. The Gulf countries pick up the tab. We pay all of the bill, expanding the base per US and NATO standard. And when the push came to shove, when it comes to this humiliating the retreat from Afghanistan, there was only Gulf countries. With the Europeans as well, we saved Europeans, British, German from Afghanistan, particularly Qatar. So we are a very reliable junior partner, but the US is not a reliable partner. The war of Russia on Ukraine led to two important things when it comes to the reshuffling and recalculations. The first was depending on ourselves has become key. The United States is reevaluating when it comes to energy security. The oil is in Gulf countries and gas in Qatar particularly. So this is the combination. And a doctor in CSIS wrote an important study, the return of the Middle East Gulf region to the centrality. So now I remembered his name, John Alterman. I remembered his name. So he's in charge of the Middle East program. And this is the CSIS. It is the #1 think tank in the world, not only in the United States. So he published an important study 3 weeks ago. It's available online if you go CSIS, John Alterman. The centrality of the Middle East again. So there's the rethinking at the level of the strategic think tanks and centers in the United States regarding the Gulf in particular. The Gulf is back to the important centrality, and the Biden administration and following administration, because of the energy security and because the Europeans are counting on this as alternative for oil, gas, and for Russian oil and gas. So, giving the importance of Gulf allies, they proved that they were reliable partners, and the energy security needs to be assured. As Israel, that is the ally of the United States, is actually embarrassing the United States with the human rights violations, the daily crimes. 170 plus Palestinians, including 50 children, were killed since the beginning of the year with U.S. weapons, and they get $3.8 billion annually paid by taxpayers in the US to buy weapons to kill the Palestinians. This is the difference. The war in Ukraine may be positive to reevaluate by US, by us. Dr. George, the question from the social media.
استعملتم مصطلح غزو روسي إلى أوكرانيا واعتبرتم أنها ممارسات
Of Ukraine, and the practices are in terrorism context. What about the Israel behavior in Palestine? Is it not extremism and terrorism?
Well, no, I mean, I think it's an important question. Since this is my second time here in the Middle East since the Ukraine shock of February 24, and there's a point that many people here in the region make that is really lost on many people in Washington, and I think it's a very important point, is that Western governments and Western media have responded to the conflict in Ukraine in ways that, yes, maybe are very principled and admirable, but there's also some serious elements of hypocrisy that speak to Islamophobia and sort of a very Eurocentric way of looking at the world. And I think this kind of hypocrisy has to be called out. We speak very much about the territorial integrity of Ukraine being something that needs to be defended at all costs, yet the United States has absolutely no problem supporting some of its friends in the MENA region that violate the sovereign rights of other countries in the region. The U.S. strongly condemned Russia's annexation of land in eastern Ukraine, but let's remember the Trump administration also put full U.S. support behind Israel's annexation of Syrian land in the Golan Heights. And by the way, the Biden administration never reversed that. That was a Trump administration policy that the Biden administration has continued. And of course, when we look at Israel's aggression against the Palestinian people, it's very clear that the U.S. is very selective when it comes to its commitment to standing by the so-called rules-based order and international law. So yeah, I completely agree that there are many layers of hypocrisy, and also this is a criticism we can extend to our friends in Europe. We remember before the Ukraine shock of February 24, I don't remember exactly when it was, but when it came to the situation along the Belarus-Poland border with many of the refugees, I think they were mainly Kurdish citizens from different Middle Eastern countries. The European Union's line was there's not enough room, there's not enough resources to take them in. And then when we saw the war in Ukraine break out in February, there was a huge embrace of the Ukrainian refugees, and I think that was the right way to respond to the conflict in Ukraine. I am not in any way criticizing the decision to host refugees. I think that was the humane response, but the point is that it was only European refugees who had that hospitality extended to them, and when there were people from the Islamic world coming, trying to come into the EU, they were told that they had to stay out. And I can understand why many people in the Middle East have been
They
quick
were
to
not told,
observe.
they were pushed. They
Excuse-
were pushed from Poland, were not allowed to enter Poland.
Right.
Water cannon and,
Yeah.
and bombs, and I mean, it was really horrible. And this is the hypocrisy at its peak.
Sure. Yeah, that's.
اوكي ناخذ سؤالين الوقت ضيق.
More questions, please. Please be straightforward in your question in the name of God. Yes, straightforward and not embarrassing. So I was very sad on my way here. Why are we like this as Arabs? Why have we been used? They took our petrol with $1, $2 until 72, and now we have strengths, dear moderator. If we use them, we would have been stronger than the US. The US would have been on its knees. Please, please be brief, please. Time is important, is more important than everything that has been said. First of all, if we do not peg the currencies in the Gulf against the dollar and we change the pricing, the equation is not going to change. This is the question. Thank you. So this is a leverage that could be used in due time. Farah Al-Barqawi, journalist in Al-Arabi TV. Both gentlemen talked about the context of the Gulf-US disagreement and particularly the visit of Biden to the region. We remember that Biden came to Saudi Arabia coming from Tel Aviv. So my question is regarding the effect or impact of this disagreement when it comes to normalization, the alliance deals, the Abraham Accord with some Gulf countries. Israel actually talked about the security of the region and facing Iran. The last question back there. At the beginning, Musa Ilam from the Doha Institute. During this session, I would like to remember or remind everyone regarding the war in Yemen and the impact when it comes to the Gulf-US relations. This dossier is going to be used by the United States. We know that the war in Europe is a violation of the sovereignty of Ukraine, and when a country, an oil country, tries to be sovereign, they say you are ruled or born to be ruled. It's just like another version of the Houthis. So is there actually a rapprochement between Saudi and the Houthis and the negotiations that are going? We know that the Americans actually protect the minorities ruling majorities in Yemen, Ethiopia, etc. And on the other hand, the Saudi Arabia has an unbiased position, biased because it supports Russia and gives it maneuver possibilities. So can we say that maybe we need to increase the efficiency in the region to achieve peace in Yemen by having direct negotiations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, just like what happened in the 70s? So Saudi and Egypt had negotiations. 5 minutes to answer, Dr. Shaiji, please. 5 minutes? Yes, 5 minutes.
شكرا. طبعا بالنسبة إلى سؤال السيدة فرح البرقاوي طبعا يعني أحد
Of course, one of the repercussions, and I think that it will decline after the midterm Congress elections on the 8th of November. If the Democrats keep their majority, 8 seats or less, so there it would be gradual end of this small storm. There will not be a big re-evaluation by Biden and the two parties. There will not be a major reassessment or reevaluation when it comes to the relation with Saudi Arabia. This is the first time that the United States reassesses its relations with an important ally and an important region for the international economy like Saudi Arabia. This is unprecedented when it comes to US reevaluating the relation with allies. If the Democrats lose, this is projected, if they lose the majority and we will see Biden crippled duck during these remaining of his tenure, the 2 years, but the ceiling for the punishment of Saudi Arabia is very limited because the United States does not want to further impact the gasoline prices and oil prices. Saudi Arabia could further reduce production, and just like our colleague who said about the Arabs possessing leverage, so Saudi Arabia could actually price the selling of oil using a basket of currencies and not US dollars. This is the nuclear option for Saudi Arabia. This is what we call it. They can sell oil with different currencies, including the US dollar. This would lead to disruption in the United States, knowing that the dollar is actually reaching a historic high with the Japanese currency. We're talking about $150. So it has become more valuable than the euro. The sterling is at its lowest levels against the US dollar. So the Saudi Arabia has some painful options, but this is unhealthy, not on the US end and also not on the Saudi end. As to how this impacts the normalization of the relations with Israel, of course, it harms normalization because the United States and President Biden was proud in Jeddah for the first time. Of course, Trump went from Riyadh to Tel Aviv, but Biden did it the other way around, from Tel Aviv to Jeddah, and said, I am the first president to inaugurate this line, and Saudi Arabia allowed soft or light normalization, allowing the Israeli carriers to fly over Saudi Arabia. So if the escalation continues in Saudi Arabia as a response to the US escalation, this would lead to freezing any attempts to normalize the relations with Israel. And I expected since 2020 that the train is going to stop on the last station when it comes to the normalization. It will be in Manama. And this so far has happened, and the fallout actually will harm the inclusion of Israel as part of what Biden thinks about the NATO, the Middle Eastern NATO, to include joint defense, missile defense system with the presence of Israel. Thank you. George.
You want to add something?
Thanks. Yeah, I would agree. I don't think that in the GCC we can expect other countries to join the Abraham Accords anytime soon. I think there could be other countries maybe in Africa that are the next ones to normalize with Israel, but I think in the GCC it will probably stick with UAE and Bahrain, at least for a long time. I do not see Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and especially not Kuwait going down the normalization route. For each of these four countries, they have their own vested interests in not entering the Abraham Accords that in some cases are unique to each country I just mentioned. That being said, the Biden administration, I think, is going to continue trying to put pressure on these countries to join the Abraham Accords. But at least in the case of Saudi Arabia, I think there are people in the White House who understand some of the sensitivities and understand how it could be very risky for Saudi Arabia to go in that direction by establishing full-fledged relations with Israel and abandoning the Arab Peace Initiative. I think more realistically, the Biden administration will try to push for Saudi Arabia to take some mini steps that certainly come short of actually entering the Abraham Accords, but serve to strengthen, if you will, sort of unofficial ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And I think probably realistically that is the most that the Biden administration will be able to hope for.
Thank you, George. في الختام إن الحرب الروسية الأوكرانية هي
At the end, this war, the Ukraine-Russia war, is the biggest topic. And of course, there are other important issues and dossiers. But we think that the energy crisis today reminds us of the oil crisis in 1973. With different factors, there are different alliances in the region that are not at the service of this region. We would like to thank the colleagues at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for the invitation, and thank our two panelists for their valuable contribution, and thank you all for being here. Assalamu alaikum.